While evangelicals often champion a gospel of greed and personal empowerment, liberals often speak on behalf of oppressed groups they never meet, advocating utopian and unrealistic schemes to bring about peace and universal love. Neither group has much interest in testing their ideologies against reality. Why did you leave Roxbury and the seminary?
Well, I went into seminary to be an ordained minister, and I became increasingly disenchanted with both liberal institutions like Harvard Divinity School as well as the liberal Presbyterian Church, which I came out of. That I felt that they paid lip service to the poor as well as lip service to values that in fact they were not willing to fight for. So it was a rupture with the institutional church, which was particularly painful because I had been raised within the institutional church. Not only was my father a parish minister for all of his life, but my mother as well was a seminary graduate, although went on to become a professor. So, you know, it was a really difficult time. This was an institution that had nurtured me. I think I still speak and think in the way that it taught me. That is sort of ethically and finally perhaps even religiously. These are not values I've necessarily discarded, but I had at that point a huge schism with the institution itself. One of my frustrations with some of the right-wing evangelicals is this emphasis on law, which is a Hebraic concept. I mean, the Ten Commandments were not, they're a product of Moses. Let's put the Beatitudes up in courtrooms. I'm all for that. And I think that there was a transformation in terms of the theological outlook of the Christian gospel as opposed to what it went before. And it's a theological outlook that I embrace and admire and seek to live by. My frustration, part of my frustration with the liberal church is that they didn't call out the proponents of the gospel of prosperity. The idea that Jesus came to make us wealthy. The idea that Jesus, who was a pacifist, would bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs all over the Middle East is heretical. And the liberal church equivocated in the name of dialogue, in the name of tolerance, word, by the way, Martin Luther King never used. I think my anger at what had been done to a religious belief system that I admired and that I think is worthy of emulation. The infusion of the worst aspects of American consumerism and imperialism into the Christian religion, and the failure on the part of the liberal church to denounce it. And that doesn't mean I'm not against evangelicals. I in fact write in the book that the real opposition to the gospel of prosperity and this rapacious right wing that has seized an element of the Christian church will not come from the liberal church, but will come out of the evangelical movement, I believe.
And we are back with our in-depth guest, Chris Hedges. Mr. Hedges, you are currently reading The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. What is that?
One of the most important books of theology of the last few decades. Cone's an amazing theologian, and this book is, which he spent 10 years writing, is a look at the utter failure on the part of white theologians in the white church to respond to the lynching of black men and women, the reign of terror in Jim Crow South. And he argues correctly that the failure on the part of the white church to understand that the crucifixion of Jesus was a lynching meant that it couldn't see the power of the crucifixion and fundamentally the message of the gospel itself within its midst. And it is really a stunning, stunning work. It's just filled with intellectual and emotional depth charges that whether you're a believer or not, you should pick up and read.
Melky Russell tweets into you, Mr. Hedges, can Chris talk about the issues a black man might face saying the same things you're saying to a white audience?
Well, look at what's happened to Cornel West when he has gotten up and criticized Barack Obama. He's been attacked roundly, including within the black mainstream media. To get up and speak an uncomfortable truth, as Cohn has done throughout his life, is to have a lot of people turn away from you, to turn their backs on you. I've spent over 2 decades of my life living among people who are not white, and I speak Spanish as well as Arabic and French. And it has been a long process as a white privileged male to begin to understand the reality of white supremacy, both as it manifests itself within the heart of the empire and on the outer reaches of empire. There are all sorts of assumptions that I can make that people who live in marginal communities and people of color cannot make. And it's important, I think, for those of us who come out of positions of privilege, and we spoke about the 2.5 years I lived in Roxbury, to put ourselves in these environments, because we're forced to confront our own blindness. And when you develop close relationships with people who suffer, whether they're Palestinian or whether they're African American in the inner city, when they become people you love and care about, and you see how entire systems are conspired against them, it becomes painful for you. But I think more importantly, you begin to see all the things that up until then you were unable to see. And that blindness, that there'll always be a kind of gulf between you and those who are oppressed. There will always be an inability to understand. You get as close as you can, you work as hard as you can, and then you accept your own deficiencies. And I think that very, very few people, one of the books you put up there was Litwack, the historian, who's really a remarkable historian, wrote a trilogy of books that I'm about to start. I teach in a prison. I'm about to start in a couple of weeks, and I'm teaching those 3 books. And it's the aftermath of the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and then he wrote a beautiful sort of thin essay, contemporary essay called When is Free Free? But very few, Howard Zinn had it, but I think very few people manage to cross those lines. And it really takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of work, and a lot of self-reflection and self-criticism.
The church also does not escape your criticism.
And I grew up in the church.
And the church historically played a significant role in progressive movements,
yes,
from the civil liberties movement
very much so.
in Canada. I mean, the whole entire social gospel movement, which
right,
led to the CCF, came from a church base. You
right,
say that basically right now the church, the traditional liberal church, has completely given up on progressive reform to the right.
Yeah, the problem with the liberal church is that we've seen the rise of a very virulent heretical movement.
You call them Christian fascists.
Yeah, they're not Christians. I graduated from seminary. My father, I was going to church since before I could read or speak. They've utterly perverted the message of the gospel. The idea that Jesus came to make us rich is an absurdity. That Jesus would bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs around the Middle East is an utter perversion of Jesus' message.
Why doesn't the traditional church fight back at those kind of allegations that hijack the Gospels?
Because most liberal institutions, they're bankrupt. They don't want to take on that kind of a very difficult and precarious battle with very powerful forces that have usurped the Christian gospel. And I think that the tangent of this is that you have figures like Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris, who are religious illiterates and bigots, whose right-wing policies do not differ in any significant way from the very Christian fundamentalists they attack. I mean, they're all chanting for war in the Middle East, and have demonized Muslims in the name of Western civilization rather than in the name of Satan. And we seeded that. I mean, what's the point of going to seminary and graduating and getting a degree if you get out into the wider culture and you see people grossly distorting the message of the gospel and you say nothing? You do nothing. I don't know whether that's in the name of tolerance. I think it's actually in the name of comfort and careerism, because the middle class, I mean the liberal class, is still able to retain positions economically that make them part of the middle class. A tenured Princeton professor makes $180,000 a year. Why aren't the heads of these universities screaming and attacking and going on the assault against creationism, which is pseudoscience? Well, they're too busy out raising money.
This is not only delusional, but in the end, I think, callous to the weak and the poor and to the working class. I think that understanding the structures and the foundations of power and how they work is extremely important. And some great political philosophers like Sheldon Wolin, probably our greatest living political philosopher, in his book Democracy Incorporated, sort of spelled it out. And he calls it, the system we live under, inverted totalitarianism, by which he means that it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in inverted totalitarianism, you have a system by which corporate forces purport to pay loyalty to the Constitution, electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet have so corrupted the levers of power as to render the citizenry powerless.
This is from Peter Eggenberger, another email. Your claims about the way the U.S. is run seems plausible, but hasn't it always been run along similar lines since 1776? Furthermore, haven't elites always run societies?
Yes, and I think that one could argue that the battle for American democracy has been one long battle against those elites. That, you know, the Native Americans, African Americans, women, men without property, none of these people were invited to the constitutional conventions. It became a battle to open up American society, and these radical movements did that. So none of these radical movements achieved political power, but they were potent forces that the power elite had to reckon with. And I think the destruction of those movements has disempowered us. I mean, one could argue that in April 1968, the most powerful political figure in the United States was Martin Luther King. Johnson was scared to death of him. A year before, King had denounced the Vietnam War. And that's because when King went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. And I think we have to rebuild those movements. For those of us who care about democracy and care about justice, it's not our job to take power. You know, Julian Benda wrote a really great book, a French intellectual, called The Treason of Intellectuals. And he said that, you know, we have a choice in life. We can serve privilege and power, or we can serve justice and truth. And those of us who commit to serving justice and truth, the more we make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more we dilute the possibilities of justice and truth. And I think King, Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass, Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, Eugene Debs, Mother Jones, you know, all of these people are figures that didn't make those concessions. And they never achieved formal positions of power, nor, frankly, did they ever strive to achieve formal positions of power. But they defended the interests of the dispossessed. As somebody who has lived in disintegrating societies, I would certainly agree that human
beings are not particularly rational. Freud got this in Civilization and its Discontents, written on the eve of World War II, where he talked about two forces, both within the individual and within the society. One being that force of eros, of love, of nurturing, of protection, of life, and the forces of thanatos, the death instinct, that instinct to annihilate all living things, including finally ourselves. And that these two forces are in eternal conflict, both within the individual and within societies at large, and that whole societies can be gripped by forces of thanatos. I think the Serbian society was at the end of the war. They giddily sort of embraced their own self-destruction and death. I think if you look at the end of Nazi Germany, there's a wonderful movie, Downfall, that I think captures it, this German film on Hitler's bunker. Yeah, it's brilliant. But it captures that kind of, having lived in those kinds of environments, it captures that kind of intoxication with death and longing for it. Yeah, I don't think human beings are rational. My struggles with Hitchens were that he, you know, when he was on the left or the right, there was never any nuance for him. He had been a former Trotskyite, and he swung all the way over and became a confidant of Paul Wolfowitz and the neocons. And, you know, he bifurcated the world into blacks and whites, us and them. And unfortunately, you know, that is a vision of reality that the closer you get to the ground just doesn't hold up.
How would you describe your relationship with Mr. Hitchens over the years? Friends, adversaries?
Deeply antagonistic.
Deeply?
Yeah.
The belief that we can achieve human perfection, that we can advance morally, is itself an evil. It provides a cover for criminality and abuse, a justification for murder. It sanctifies war, murder, and torture for an unattainable absolute.
Yeah, the idea that time is linear. That's peculiar to both the Hebrew and the Christian Bible, which was adopted by the Enlightenment. The idea that, you know, we're getting better and better, that human progress is inevitable, is a myth. You know, the Greeks, most Asian cultures see time as cyclical, that you have both within the individual and within civilizations a time of birth and maturation and decay and decrepitude and death. And I think history bears that out. I don't think there's anything in human history or human nature to justify the idea that we are advancing morally as a species. That doesn't mean we don't make moral advances, we do, but we also make moral reverses. And I think what we've done is equate technological progress with moral progress, and that's very dangerous. That technology is an instrument that serves the ambitions of humankind, but I don't think human nature changes very much. And this being lulled into this false belief that science or technology will, for instance, save us from global warming is essentially the modern equivalent to the ancient religious sects that people adopted as Easter Island was decimated and the environment essentially destroyed to a point where it no longer could sustain a human population. And I think we have to wake up that there is nothing inevitable about human progress, that it's far more important that we face and confront reality and deal with it. And if we don't, if we keep this naive belief, in essence, technology is sort of serves what in medieval times would have been God. And unless we shake ourselves free from that, we're in very big trouble. The Committee for Public Information and the sort of you know, dark figure, the Grand Inquisitor type figure becomes Walter Lippmann, who ends up writing a Public Opinion in 1922, sort of the blueprint for control. Manufacturing consent is his phrase. And it's how you use propaganda effectively to manufacture consent. And you don't actually need the harsher measures of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, except for the most recalcitrant forces or radical forces. Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, Debs himself ends up going to prison. But propaganda becomes, in the right hands, in the hands of the state, a much more effective tool to herd people where you want them. And the most important thing about the Committee for Public Information is that it drew on the understanding of crowd psychology or mass psychology pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and of course Sigmund Freud. That people were not moved by fact or reason, but manipulated by emotion. And this system of mass propaganda, which created a kind of permanent fear of course, the Hun, was transferred the moment the war was over to the dreaded Red. And there's a great writer I like very much, Dwight MacDonald, who writes of this period, and he said, essentially the war, World War I, was the rock on which these movements broke. Now, this is absolutely vital to understanding what happened to American democracy, because these movements never took formal political power, and yet they were the true correctives to in terms of opening up our democracy. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, later the civil rights movement. These were movements that pressured the liberal class to respond. We saw perhaps the best example of it during the Great Depression, where you had figures like Roosevelt and his vice president, Henry Wallace. And these were liberals who responded to the plight of the underclass and made incremental and piecemeal reform possible. That's what the liberal class is supposed to do when it works. And Conrad Black, when he writes his biography of Roosevelt, said that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism, and Black was right. And what we've seen with the destruction of those radical and populist movements in the name of the Red Scare in the 50s, remember, with the McCarthy hearings, we saw thousands of university professors, social workers, journalists essentially purged from their positions. I.F. Stone, probably our greatest investigative journalist, becomes a non-person. He can't even get a job at The Nation magazine. And that was disastrous because we lost the pressure on the liberal establishment, and then in the name of sort of the battle against anti-communism, we hollowed these liberal institutions out from the inside. So that by the 1970s, let's say, there was no longer any bulwark to protect us from the corporate state. And we were transferred, I think correctly, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, by the early 1970s, from an empire, what he calls a production, to an empire of consumption. We began to borrow to maintain both a lifestyle and a level of consumption, as well as an empire we could no longer afford. And that the impediments to that, which had been in place, were essentially removed. And you end up with what I would say are faux liberals, people who speak the language of traditional liberalism, like Bill Clinton, and yet serve the interests of the corporate state. So it's under a Democratic administration under Clinton that we get some of the most egregious assaults against the working class in this country. NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of working men and women in this country since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948. The destruction of welfare. I mean, one of the reasons they keep extending unemployment benefits is because, courtesy of Bill Clinton, once those unemployment benefits run out and you do not have a job, you have to attempt to live on about $143 a month, courtesy of the welfare system. The deregulation of the FCC, so that you have Rupert Murdoch's News Corp and Clear Channel buying up literally thousands of stations, radio and television stations, consolidating it into one entity. The destruction of the banking system. This was all done under Clinton. And Obama comes in and essentially codifies the destruction of both domestic and international law put in place by the Bush administration, so that he doesn't restore basic civil liberties. In fact, he carries out a further egregious assault against them, the capacity of the executive branch to order the assassination of American citizens, this new Military Detention Act whereby people can be picked up if they are deemed in the nebulous term a terrorist and denied due process and held in military brigs.
Chris Hedges, back to your book, Death of the Liberal Class. You write that the creed of impartiality and objectivity that has infected the liberal class teaches, ultimately, the importance of not offending the status quo. The professionalism demanded in the classroom, in newsprint, in the arts, or in political discourse is code for moral disengagement.
Of course, because what you end up doing is paying deference to institutions like Goldman Sachs, which are criminal enterprises. You pay deference to power centers that have long ago walked away from responsible citizenship. whether it's coal companies in Appalachia, or whether it's chemical plants that are polluting rivers, or whether it's Wall Street. And I think that inability to make those moral judgments has rendered the liberal class not only useless, but despised by large segments of American society. And I think, frankly, they have every right to be despised, because they posit themselves as sort of the moral voice, the conscience of the nation. And yet I think have failed miserably. And my book, Death of the Liberal Class, is really an attack on the pillars of the liberal establishment. The liberal church, which I come out of. I'm a seminary graduate. My father was a minister, grew up in the church. The press, and I also come out of it, 15 years at the New York Times, over 20 as a journalist. Labor unions, which of course have withered, and now we're seeing a final assault against public sector unions, the last sort of readout of unionized activity in the United States. Culture, which has become commercialized junk largely, and education itself, which has become increasingly geared towards keeping people within their economic strata and giving them the vocational skills to serve the interests of the corporate state.
This is Molly Ivins writing. I have heard many an editor say, well, we're being attacked by both sides, so we must be right. Stems from the curious notion that if you get a quote from both sides, preferably in an official position, you've done the job. In the first place, most stories aren't two-sided, they're 17-sided at least. In the second place, it's of no help to either the reader or the truth to quote one side saying cat and the other side saying dog, while the truth is there's an elephant crashing around there in the bushes.
Well, she got it. And that's why programs like The Daily Show or Colbert are so popular, because they poke fun at this absurdity of balance, where you get one lying pundit from the right and one lying pundit from the so-called left, and some cynical, overpaid news celebrity sitting in the middle who knows that both are lying through their teeth and refuse to say anything. And I think that that is a kind of betrayal of the viewer or the reader. That it's our job as journalists, insofar as we can, to tell the reader or the viewer the truth, however unpleasant that truth may be, and however it may cost us in terms of popularity. And I think journalists are, if you go into that profession and you're looking for popularity, you're in the wrong profession. We should have a kind of constant antagonism to power. Whoever's in power, I don't really care where it comes from. Figures like I.F. Stone or Orwell are sort of my heroes because of that. And these were not impartial people. These were not people who didn't have strong opinions, but they understood that the truth was sacred. And Orwell, like Stone, they were quite willing to anger their leftist support. I remember Homage to Catalonia. Orwell's great memoir of the Civil War included a chapter where he was an anarchist. He was fighting with the POUM, and the communists, the Comintern, the Stalinists came into Barcelona and gunned them all down. And Orwell put it in and published the book while the war was still going on. It only sold 600 copies during his lifetime, but it was, Orwell said, the power of the short-term lie is just not something I'm going to engage in. And in the long term, the truth has to be told, even if it ostensibly hurts a cause. Now, Orwell was shot through, almost killed on the Argonne front, shot through the neck and wounded fighting against the fascists. And yet he wouldn't lie on behalf of the Republicans. And that really is the gold standard. So these people were not in the way of sort of commercial journalism defined in any way as objective or impartial, but they told the truth.
Mr. Hedges, from your first book, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, you write, "The enduring attraction of war is this: even with its destruction and carnage, it can give us what we long for in life. It can give us purpose, meaning, a reason for living." You go on to write, "The communal march against an enemy generates a warm, unfamiliar bond with our neighbors, our community, our nation, wiping out unsettling undercurrents of alienation and dislocation. War in times of malaise and desperation is a potent distraction." And finally, "Despite all this, I am not a pacifist. There are times when the force wielded by one immoral faction must be countered by a faction that, while never moral, is perhaps less immoral.
And I say that with a great deal of pain, because I know what violence does. I know the poison that it is. And yet I was, as I said, in Sarajevo when it was being hit with 2,000 Serbian shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day, including 2,000 children being killed in that city. 45 foreign correspondents were killed there, dozens were wounded. And we understood, those of us who were in that besieged city, completely surrounded, that if the Serbs broke through the trenches, or literally they were defended by sort of World War I style trenches around the city, a third of the city would probably be massacred and the rest would be driven into displacement and refugee camps. And we'd seen it in the Drina Valley, we'd seen it in Vukovar. We knew what the pattern was. We knew what the modus operandi was. And one understands when you are faced with the very real possibility of not only your own annihilation, but the annihilation of your family, your children, your community, how you pick up a weapon. Now, unfortunately, once you do that, you cross a line. You are not free from the poison of violence. And initially, those who organized the defenses in Sarajevo were gangsters. They came from the criminal class, Cello and others. And when they weren't shooting at Serbs across the barricades, they were raiding the apartments of ethnic Serbs in the city, looting them, and sometimes executing them. You know, one of the reasons that I am such a strong and vocal supporter of the Occupy movement is because it is nonviolent. And the corporations know only one word: it's more. They will push and push and push until there's a reaction. And I want that reaction not to descend into violence, because I know what violence does. That violence, even when it is employed in ostensibly a just cause, as Nietzsche said, pits your monsters against their monsters. And then it just always becomes tragic. I don't believe in just war. I think sometimes human beings are pushed to such an extent that violence is inevitable. But the consequences for those who employ violence on both sides is catastrophic. And, I'd spent a lot of my life, not only, of course, in the Middle East, but in Iraq. I understood, like most Arabists, that the arguments used to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq were non-reality based. This is not a political discussion. It's the idea that we would be greeted as liberators and there wouldn't be an insurgency, that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East, that, remember, the oil would pay for the reconstruction. I mean, these were just spun by people who had no idea what they were talking about. And but to get up and say that, despite the wealth of experience that I had within the region and within Iraq itself, became deeply polarizing. And I gave a commencement address that I'd been saying it, but you know, it came to a sort of a head when I gave a commencement address at Rockford College, where I was booed off of the stage, had my microphone cut. People stood up and started shouting things against me. At one point, they stood up and sang "God Bless America," and I was actually escorted off of the platform before the awarding of diplomas, since they didn't want any sort of fracas by close contact with students. And this got picked up by Fox and the sort of trash talk media, which looped it, you know, hour after hour. And the New York Times responded by giving me a formal written reprimand. Now, we were guild at the Times, which means we're unionized, and the process is you give the employee a written reprimand, and then the next time they're fired. So I faced a difficult choice, which is that I would have to, in essence, muzzle myself in service of my career. But, you know, on a fundamental level, I was very close to my dad, who was a great minister and an activist in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the gay rights movement. His brother was gay, and he was very outspoken supporter of gay rights. You know, I realized at that point that to do so would be to betray my father, and I wasn't going to do that, and so I left the paper. Because of my relationship with the Marine Corps, I spoke to about 250 colonels and lieutenant colonels on the eve of the Iraq War, and got up and gave this long, hour-long talk as to why this thing was really not a good idea. And all of those people, because they were putting their men on the line, because it's them who pay the price, there was no disagreement. They understood this. was folly. They did their duty, but they knew it was insane. And you saw Shinseki and a few other military leaders at very high levels walk out of this program because of that. So the idea that somehow the military is a monolith, or that you don't have figures like Colonel Fallon, and having spent time in the military, I have tremendous respect for them. And I think in some ways we've done a terrible disservice to them. I mean, the idea that somehow it's a volunteer force and therefore they ask for what they get. We have plunged thousands of families in this country into perpetual grief and loss. And for what? We don't have a right to do that. We don't have a right to do that to these men and women. As I said, I'm not a pacifist, but you only go to war as a last resort, as a final imperative, because the costs are so great. My best guess is that the Iranian regime is trying to build a nuclear weapon. But having come out of the Middle East and spent as long as I have in the Middle East, that doesn't worry me. What worries me is the transference of that technology to non-state groups. Iran has an address, and states that have an address are, I think, very unlikely to use those weapons. I think that Iran wants it as a defensive measure. I think they understand that if Iraq, for instance, had had a nuclear weapon in the way that North Korea has nuclear weapons, the Americans would not have invaded. I'm not pretending to speak for the Iranian regime, but this is my assessment. I think Pakistan is probably, in fact, in terms of the proliferation of nuclear technology, more dangerous than Iran. And frankly, Pakistan is more unstable. Pakistan frightens me more than Iran does. Okay, will they eventually get a weapon? I suspect they will. I think attacking them would be deeply counterproductive. First of all, there are roughly 1,000 sites that have been picked out. Many of these are in highly populated areas, so the loss of civilian life would be catastrophic. Remember that Iraq is primarily Shia, and I think that an attack on Iran would be interpreted throughout the Muslim world as an attack on Shiism itself. 2 million Shiites in Saudi Arabia. Bahrain is primarily Shia. Shia minorities in countries like Pakistan itself. And I think then you would have a kind of conflict go regional. It is my understanding that the Iranians, if attacked, even if Americans are not directly involved, and it is primarily an Israeli attack, although I'm not sure that's possible because I think they have to fly over Iraqi airspace, they will obliterate any American bases, including the Green Zone, in Iraq, with, of course, heavy loss of American life. So I don't want to defend the Iranian regime. They're a pretty perfidious group. Yet at the same time, I think that attacking Iran would really be a disaster.
Is it in American interest to be supporting all these dictators?
Well, I think you saw that in the Middle East, the way the American government clung to Hosni Mubarak until the last minute, deeply angered an Egyptian population that was looking for genuine democratic reform. Whose interests, are they promoting? They're not promoting the interests of their people, and they're certainly not promoting the interests of genuine democracy. And yet they're reliable allies in the quote-unquote war on terror and against the rise of Islamic fundamentalism or Islamic radicalism. But, the war on terror has just become the new mantra in the way that we supported all sorts of very heinous dictators in the war on communism, including figures like Ceausescu or Somoza in Nicaragua or Pinochet in Chile. And it becomes a kind of very simplistic way to deal with the world, and I think ultimately in ways that are to our detriment, because standing up for human rights. I mean, one of the things about being in Latin America during the Carter administration was that Carter actually tried to take human rights seriously and alienated the junta in Argentina, the military junta in Bolivia, where I was living at the time. Somoza himself turned away weapons ships. And so the governments of Latin America were screaming sort of bloody murder and denouncing Carter as a traitor. And yet when you walk through this, only time in my life really, except for maybe in the revolutions in Eastern Europe or in Iran, which is on the street, probably the most pro-American country in the world, that I go through the street and people lauded me because I was an American. And I think that determining foreign policy based on commercial or corporate interests is not only morally wrong, but misguided. And winning the hearts and minds of the populace itself is a far more effective tactic. But unfortunately, foreign policy is dominated by these interests, and both military force and diplomatic policy largely sees itself as making host countries amenable to corporate domination.
What's the worst place you've ever been, or the worst situation you've ever been in?
There have been moments, of course, where I thought it would be killed. So I mean, but those were moments. In terms of a place, it would be Sarajevo, because there was nowhere to hide. You sort of have to come out of the military to understand what it was like, because you have to know the weapon systems that were being used against us. 155 howitzers, 90mm tank rounds, Katyusha rockets that are fired in bursts of 12 or 24 and can take down a 4 or 5 story apartment building in a matter of seconds, killing everyone inside. This was the kind of heavy ordnance that was being lobbed on top of us 24 hours a day, and coupled with the sniper fire. So it was like being in a, in a kind of, it was like being a rat in a cage. I mean, you couldn't get out, and you were constantly being zapped, and it had the same kind of psychological effect where it just ground you down. It was really, your nerves break. I mean, combat units know this. I mean, you can't keep, I think it's, they did studies in the military that after 30 or 60 days of continuous combat, 98% of the unit will have become psychologically impaired, and the 2% that aren't were psychologically impaired to begin with. In other words, you stay that long in a situation like that, you inevitably go insane, which is why combat units are rotated out of conflict. I mean, courage is never a constant, despite all these John Wayne movies. And so that was true with Sarajevo. It just ground you down in a way that in El Salvador you would go out into conflictive areas, but you came back to the relative safety of the capital, San Salvador. In Sarajevo, there was no safe place to be.
We live in the United States in, I think, what is probably more properly termed inverted totalitarianism. That's a term coined by the great political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, taught at Berkeley and Princeton. And inverted totalitarianism is different from classical totalitarianism. Number one, it's not built around a demagogue or a charismatic leader. It does not tear down old structures to create new edifices. It purports to honor democracy, the Constitution, electoral politics. But it has so corrupted the levers of power that it makes democracy dysfunctional. It, unlike classical totalitarianism, where politics or economics is subordinate to politics, in inverted totalitarianism, economics or politics is subverted to economic interests, which creates a different form of ruthlessness. The educational system has been completely hijacked by people who create systems managers, those who are competent at managing a system but not questioning it. The withering of the humanities has had a devastating consequence. Now, the humanities are about asking the broad moral questions about the common good, about how a society should be constructed. True intellectual introspection is about challenging assumptions and structures. But this, especially within the corporatized walls of universities, is deemed, quote-unquote, political. And there has been a huge witch hunt against those professors that have, quote-unquote, liberal bias in the same way that they've gone after them. This is
a code really for moral autonomy. What we have done is destroy those voices that provide a kind of moral center for how we should be structuring a society. And the universities, the elite universities where I've taught at Princeton, Columbia, and NYU, are particularly guilty because they reward a very narrow kind of intelligence, an analytical intelligence.
Yeah, well, your critique is what they're doing is they're imparting skills rather than wisdom.
It's vocational.
Yeah, but their defense would be, well, you know, we have to prepare the next generation's workforce.
Well, what are they preparing them for? They're preparing them to move people's money around electronically 12 hours a day for huge firms that engage in speculation, that are really parasitic and do nothing for the economy at large. In the 17th century, speculators were hung. Today, they are given billions of dollars of taxpayer money in bailouts. And that inability to question structures is what's killing us, because the only thing we are capable of doing is attempting to sustain a dying edifice, which means throwing truckloads of money at a system that has already failed. And that is I think, a direct result of a kind of winnowing within our educational process, whereby other forms of intelligence, moral intelligence, creative intelligence, are punished or marginalized. And this very narrow, test-taking, rote-learning, drone-like intelligence is celebrated and elevated.
My deep love of the humanities, a belief that people need to be taught not what to think, but how to think, and understanding that true intellectual activity is by its nature subversive. Plato understood this. It's about questioning structures and assumptions. The withering of the liberal arts, which frightens me. We see, like, University of Albany has budget cuts, so it closes the classics department, its foreign language departments, theater departments, and everybody is sort of trotted off towards major in economics. The rise of for-profit universities where they don't even teach humanities. This is, I think, very frightening because it robs us of a vocabulary and robs us of an ability to critique the systems around us, and we all end up serving systems. We're trained how to serve these systems. The book Empire of Illusion, the subtext is the end of literacy and the triumph of spectacle. It is the triumph of spectacle. What are we? Our emotional and intellectual energies are diverted to what? The Kardashian. I can hardly keep up with it. The Kardashians or Anthony Weiner's boxer shorts, or it's just every week there's something else. And it's, go back and read the end of ancient Rome. Cicero, inveighing against the absurdities of a Nero and of the Colosseum, and the investment of emotional and intellectual life into the arena, and look at the entertainment industry, the way sports, professional sports, college sports, celebrity culture has essentially, they flicker like the images on the wall of Plato's cave, and we're unable to see that the world's on fire. And so I think the caller is right, that it really is that dire, it really is that serious, and yet the culture of celebrity and the culture of spectacle and the culture of illusion is so powerful and is disseminated in so many ways that we're anesthetized.
Now, we should make it clear to our viewers, why you're concerned about this. I mean, the book is subtitled, this is the end of literacy. You think a lot of this illusion creates almost magical thinking, delusional thinking among, and we've lost our capacity in some ways to discern reality.
Right, and I think societies that lose that capacity to separate illusion from reality die. Because if you are making judgments about yourself and the direction of your society based on illusions, you're not operating in a reality-based universe, and the consequences of that are catastrophic. There are seismic changes that are undergoing, that the United States is undergoing, and the culture at large is undergoing, with the collapse of globalization, the destruction of personal wealth. We in the United States have added to it tremendous debt, which we can never repay, now in terms of commitments and loans and guarantees into the trillions, over $12 trillion. We are borrowing to sustain an empire that we can no longer afford. We are borrowing to sustain a lifestyle that we can no longer afford. I mean, real wages in the United States have declined since 1973, and people sustain their lifestyle through credit. Well, that is all, of course, drying up. Banks, although they've been bailed out by the taxpayers, are not giving credit anymore. And yet, we believe that it's all going to come back. We believe that we are still the most powerful and the most virtuous nation on the planet. And that incapacity to grasp the severe new limitations that we are about to face, the destruction of our financial system, has left us clinging to fantasy, to magical thinking. What we're in essence trying to do is borrow our way back to a bubble economy of 2006. And the danger of that is that when you believe, and this is just across popular culture, that if you just dig deep enough within yourself, if you find that inner strength and fortitude, if you grasp that you are truly exceptional, you can have everything you want.
You're also very critical of the positive thinking, the kind of the feel-good psychology movement of Tony Robbins. Much like wrestling, people would say, what harm is there in this kind of feel-good stuff?
The danger of it is that you become responsible for your predicament. You are to blame. This has been devastating for especially the working class. There are no jobs. These former manufacturing centers in places like Youngstown, Ohio, are boarded up. They look like bombed out wrecks. The industry has literally been crated up and shipped off to China or Mexico. And of course, in many of the plants now, there's large-scale factory closings along the Mexican border as people or corporations ship these factories to China, so where workers get 10 cents an hour instead of 90 cents an hour.
So this, in your view, is also delusional, just telling people that all you have to do is kind of think positively.
Sure,
and all
because
your
if there
problems
are
will
no
go away.
jobs, if there have been huge structural changes within the United States that have made it almost impossible for blue-collar workers to sustain themselves and their families. And they have not only lost hope, but they realize that their children, there's no chance that their children will ever be able to replicate the kind of lifestyle that in the 50s, 60s, and into the early 70s was possible for blue-collar workers. And so Tony Robbins and positive psychologists and people who tell them that they have to, that it's all about attitude, create this delusional idea and any kind of analysis of reality that is bleak or dark or negative is dismissed as unhelpful because it's not happy and positive. And this only propels us back into magical thinking, that we can have everything we want, that it doesn't matter what the corporate state does to the structures of the society. If we just believe, if we have faith in ourselves, reality can be overcome. And this, this magical thinking is imparted across the culture, whether it's Tony Robbins, whether it's the Christian right, whether it's Oprah Winfrey, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's television. It is a common denominator in all of the ideologies that are thrown out.
Well, in fact, you see it permeating kind of almost human resource policies in corporate America, the same techniques used in positive psychology. Give me some examples of that.
Well, it's very much a part of corporatism, as anyone who has worked in a corporation, as I did at the New York Times, understands. You take corporate retreats, you tell people that quotas, if you're in advertising, can always be raised, profits can always be raised, what's happening outside the doors of your corporation are irrelevant. It is about the happy kind of conformity, any kind of challenging of the organization, the direction of the organization, and the very authoritarian structure of these organizations becomes a form of dissent which breaks the familial, harmonious collective that is being formed within the corporation. There's a kind of Maoist quality to it, in that any kind of challenging of the corporate structure is again blamed on the individual who is trying to obstruct the happiness and the prosperity of the corporate whole. Corporations are particularly pernicious, and that these positive psychologists are make quite a good living being brought into these corporate structures to teach that kind. And I have passages in the book about people who've attended these seminars where they are told that it's all about being happy. And of course, none of us are ever as happy as we appear. There are anxieties and troubles, but all of this has to be hidden under kind of a cheerful, fake veneer.
And frankly, it's a myth that's used to beat up on the poor. So there are no jobs in Camden. They used to make Campbell's soup in Camden. Even that's gone. Everything's gone. The schools are dysfunctional, gigantic dropout rate. The streets are unsafe. And to somehow tell a poor black child who's not getting an adequate education, not being raised in an environment that provides safety and security and nurturing, and upon that being tossed out into a city where there is no work, that they have to dig deep enough within themselves, is really a way for us to turn our backs on the vulnerable and the poor, and to say, you are responsible. This is what the called cultural message is. You are responsible for your fate. And that's just the way the corporate state wants it, as it sheds job after job after job, as larger and larger segments of American society are reduced to subsistence level, without any kind of job security, without any kind of adequate health insurance, that it's sort of their fault because they haven't managed to tap into their inner strength.
And with a corporatized media, we have 6 or 8 corporations that control virtually everything we see, read, hear, and think in the United States, has created a kind of faux debate where arguments that really should have no validity in an open society are given great import and weight. And that's not changed and is not changing.
Clearly, I mean, you see this concentration of interest in the traditional media, but that you have running parallel the internet, which is supposed to be the great democratization of media, giving voice to all. You don't see it that way.
No, because what the internet does, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone else who uses the internet, is that it propels you to retreat into intellectual ghettos, where, you know, the failure of newsprint was, or the lies that newsprint told, were generally the lies of omission. It's what they didn't tell you. If a reporter went out and investigated and reported and interviewed somebody, I mean, generally you could trust that information as being correct. And on the internet, the entire ethic of gathering reality-based information and facts is jettisoned. You don't report on the internet. There's almost no reporting. People don't even pick up a phone. It's not edited. It's not collected. It's not fact-checked. It's the inverse of what happens with print. And you put anything out there. And that becomes very dangerous because as this garbage gets filtered into intellectual ghettos or ideological ghettos, where people are looking for facts, opinions, lies, anything that bolsters their
This would be like-minded sites where people would go.
Sure, it's how you get the birther movement. You
Right.
know, that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States.
That belief has actually gone up over the course of his tenure.
Exactly.
I'd like to know what your thoughts are on slavery, blacks in America, and reparations for the oppressed black population. I think something similar to the Marshall Plan would be in order.
Well, the civil rights movement was a legal victory, but it was not a victory in the sense that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X defined it, because they knew that if there was no economic justice, there could never be racial justice. And I think part of the power of the Occupy movement is that it picks up where the civil rights movement left off, that economic justice is the only way to finally overcome racial injustice, that for the bottom 2/3 of Americans, that the civil rights movement pulled about 1/3 of the African American community into the middle class. But remember, if you look at the statistics, now as the bottom is falling out on the middle class, it's African American families that are suffering
disproportionately, even within the middle class itself. And I think one could argue that for the bottom two-thirds of African Americans in this country, things are worse than they were when King marched in Memphis or Birmingham or Selma. And we as white Americans have a special responsibility because of the long night of slavery, the destruction of families, the destruction of religion, the destruction of language, the destruction of culture. Even their names were taken from them, in the same way that Germany has a kind of eternal responsibility for what was done to Jews during the Holocaust. And we have walked out on that responsibility. The best schools in this country should be in cities like Camden. The most intricate systems of familial and especially childhood support and medical care should be in the poorest aspects of this country, because these are people who have had the least chance to go anywhere. And one understands very quickly when you spend times in places like Roxbury or Camden, all of the institutions that work to keep the poor poor. Rents in cities like Camden are staggeringly high. Any kind of ability to sustain yourself within the informal economy, which often revolves either around, and families are split. You're either working for the police or in the correction system, or oftentimes you're on the street trying to make money selling drugs. The prison industrial complex and what it has done to African Americans, as the great poet Yusuf Komunyakaa has written, the cell block has replaced the auction block. And that's part of the reason I teach in a prison, because these people have had no chance. And they know that when they get out and they apply for a job, even if they can find a job to apply for, they have to check that box saying they were a felon, that they're stigmatized, that they can't vote, they can't get loans, their credit rating is destroyed. The last time I taught there, I taught American history. What I did is bring in copies of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which fortunately nobody in the prison vetted, and taught it when Zinn is particularly conscious of what African Americans have suffered throughout American history. But there were days I just walked out into the parking lot of prison and just wept, because there were so many great minds, so many great kids that would tend to be young, who thirst for knowledge, who wanted a life, and I understood, but more importantly, they understood all of the walls that had been built around to deny them that. So I think when you use the word reparations, I think yes, not in terms of maybe cash checks, but in terms of building social programs. Lyndon Johnson made a step towards this, towards bringing these people back into the embrace of the country as a whole. I think that, as a previous caller mentioned, there should be heavy state intervention into impoverished areas, not only in our inner cities, but in rural enclaves where poverty has become tremendous. Much of my own family comes from rural areas of Maine. Food deserts, supermarkets closed down, loss of employment, tremendous suffering. And I, in that sense, am a believer of the, I lived in Switzerland, and I saw a state, certainly not in any ways a perfect state, but one where everybody had health insurance, where there was no homeless. Now tax rates are very high, 40 or 50%. It has one of the best public education systems in the world. Senior teachers earn as much as doctors. This is more towards the kind of society that I would like to see us build, where we distribute our resources so everyone has a chance. Look, I spent a lot of time with military units, and the best military units never leave their wounded or dead on the field, even corpses. They still mean something. They're not just commodities, although their utility to the unit, I suppose, could be argued is gone. And I've seen soldiers and Marines crawl out and bring these bodies back. And these were always the units with the highest morale and the most effective fighting capacity. It's the units who left their wounded and dead on the field and walked away that rapidly disintegrated. And I think that's what we're doing as a nation. We need to rebuild that solidarity, that community, that sense that when you stumble and fall, I will reach down and help pick you up if we're going to make it. And I think we have allowed corporate values, whether it's through reality television. Reality TV is essentially about corporatism. It's about the celebration of values that are characteristic of psychopaths: self-aggrandizement, incapacity for remorse or guilt, betrayal. One builds false friendships and then betrays them. For what? For fleeting fame and a little money. And it's just writ large throughout the whole culture. And we have to begin to question our value system if we're going to make it. And I think one of the most important questions is, what are we going to do about all those people that we've turned or allowed to be treated like human refuse?
Are we, 10 years after 9/11, any wiser about what led to the rise of al-Qaeda, of what is our own share of responsibility in this situation, and have we changed anything in light of what we know?
Well, we live in this wonderful nation that embraces historical amnesia. Nothing ever makes sense. People who carry out acts of terrorism are incomprehensible to us. We certify them as incomprehensible, and once we certify them as incomprehensible, therefore all investigation into what drove them to carry out these acts, which are criminal acts, are irrelevant. And that's extremely dangerous. Al-Qaeda was created through American money, which was funneled through the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service, during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. They starved secular movements, and the ISI gave money to radical groups because for Pakistan the issue is India. And they knew that a radical Islamist movement, armed movement, was never going to make peace with Delhi. And that's all they've cared about, that's all they've ever cared about. And so it was our money that created these organizations. When Iraq invaded Kuwait and occupied Kuwait, Osama bin Laden asked the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, he's a Saudi citizen, of course, or was till they took it away from him, to come back and help organize the defense. Instead, we began at that moment to see massive military occupation by the United States, not just in Saudi Arabia, but ultimately throughout the Middle East, occupying directly two countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, carrying out proxy wars in Yemen and Pakistan, but also putting bases, scattering bases all throughout the region. And the fundamental engine towards jihadism and towards terrorism, ultimately, is not al-Qaeda. It is the occupation of the Middle East. And I speak as someone who spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. This is readily apparent to those of us who were on the ground in the region at the time. But to even raise this as an issue as part of the debate is suddenly to be painted as some kind of a political extremist.
There's a man, Sam Richards, who teaches a very popular course on racism at Penn State, and he caused ructions recently with a TED Talk that had David Horowitz and other people on the right describing him as one of the most dangerous academics in America. What was his lecture about? It was about having empathy for our enemies in order to understand them better. How do we change policy if that's what dissenters like yourself are up against?
You can't. And, you know, the thing is about empathy, which is key, absolutely key. You have to be able to place yourself in the shoes of the other, even the enemy. And to practice empathy is not to condone. To understand is not to condone what they do. But if we don't understand what it is that makes them do it, then we respond as we have responded. We speak to these people in the only language they understand, which is the language of violence.
But if a man who teaches empathy, just that, what you said, not endorsement, but empathy, is classified as dangerous, what happens?
Well, that's why we're dying. I mean, that's why we're dying as an empire. That's why we're dying as a nation, because we have cut off the capacity for empathy. We have elevated the cult of the self above and beyond everything else. And that has had attendant ramifications within our press. There are no foreign bureaus. There are no foreign pages, as when I began in the business, in any of the major metropolitan dailies. Look at the charade of nightly news, which I don't own a TV, so I only get it in bursts. But I was in the gym the other night, and watching Katie Couric, who I find repugnant, but she was on the screen, talking about some 29-year-old congressman with great abs who was on the cover of Men's Health. I said, this is just lunacy, and I switched it to NBC, and it was the same story. It's funny on the one hand, but it's for those of us who have spent, and I spent 20 years of my life reporting outside the United States, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying.
This is one of the things that you'll find on our news, and not just on Fox News, all over, but this does happen to be from Fox. Take a look.
What, 1 billion Muslims in the world, right? Okay. How many do you think, what percentage do you think, buy into this radical jihadist, you know, you're doing God's will, 72 virgins, war with the infidels? What percentage do you think of the faith believes that?
Well, Sean, credible estimates say 10 to 15% of all Muslims. There's 1.6 billion Muslims worldwide. That's 157 million. That's a lot of Muslims.
157 million out to get us. I mean, you've got two things there. One, obviously, the rising phobia being stoked around Islam.
Racism.
And then you also have fear, stoking of fear of people who are vulnerable to that kind of racism. Well,
of course, because all the troglodytes who brought us the Cold War need to create a culture of fear to justify the surrender of our civil liberties, as well as the dumping of half of all of discretionary spending into a war industry. And that culture of fear, which has been with us since the end of World War I, created really by Wilson and the Committee for Public Information. They've just switched a few words here and there. Al-Qaeda is completely broken as an organization. It does not pose, and never did pose, an existential threat to the existence of the United States. But it is a convenient tool in the hands of a war industry and in the hands of the ruling corporate elite that know that if we can be made afraid, we can be rendered passive, and that's precisely how it is used. This thing about the Muslim world, where did all these experts come from? They've never been there. They don't speak Arabic. It is staggering. I don't go around speaking about China. I don't speak Chinese. I've never been there. And yet they pump out this absolutely racist, stereotypical caricatures of a fifth of the world's population, of which they know nothing. And it's accepted on the mainstream. The things that are now said about Muslims in this country, it could not be said about any other ethnic group. And I find it very frightening, because when we suffer another terrorist attack on American soil, this propaganda and racism and hate talk has, I fear, laid the grounds for attacks against innocent American citizens who happen to be Muslim, especially those who are observant, are wearing...
Are visible.
Yeah, are visible and are observant to their faith.
You think a future attack is a when, not an if?
Well, look, I covered Al-Qaeda for the New York Times, and every intelligence chief I ever interviewed never used the word if. It was always when. And whether it may not be Al-Qaeda, but we have certainly spent the last decade doing the best job possible of stoking the rage and the collective humiliation of Muslims who do not want us occupying Muslim soil, and we would react no differently.
The power of technology to create events that are not real, but that appear real, has warped our perception of the world around us. I know it as a war correspondent, having spent 20 years covering conflicts around the globe. I know the reality of war. And yet the perception of war, especially given the capacity of Hollywood to create images and special effects, is totally a total variance with what's real. And yet people have, who've never been to war, have a belief that they understand something about it, because the pseudo-event replaces reality itself. We confuse how we're made to feel with knowledge. We confuse propaganda with ideology.